We have a protocol here, and you are going to wait like everyone else. If you cannot manage that, there is a waiting room down the hall where you belong." The voice cut clean across the intake desk. It did not lower itself. It did not consider who was listening. The nurse behind the counter, a woman in pale blue scrubs, with a laminated badge clipped to her breast pocket, did not look up from her screen when she said it. She typed something, deleted it, typed it again. The woman standing on the other side of the counter, a woman in a charcoal wool coat with a silver clasp at the collar, holding herself very still, said nothing. She pressed one hand flat against the countertop. The overhead fluorescence made the whole lobby the color of old milk. A child in the row of plastic chairs behind her had stopped crying. The room had gone the particular quiet that happens when people decide not to witness something. The nurse finally looked up. She looked at the wool coat, at the natural hair pulled back with the kind of precision that takes years to master, at the overnight bag resting at the woman's feet, and she made a calculation. It lasted less than 2 seconds. "Ma'am, I need you to take a number and have a seat. We will call you when we are ready." The woman took the number. She sat down. She folded both hands in her lap and stared at the small paper slip. 47, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. She had been in this hospital for 11 days before tonight. She knew where every supply closet was on the 3rd and 4th floors. She knew which elevator stuck on the 4th floor if you pressed the button before the doors had fully closed. She knew the name of the woman who restocked the vending machines on Tuesday nights. A woman named Gloria who kept photographs of her grandchildren in a lanyard around her neck. She knew the name of the attending who worked the overnight Thursday rotation. And she knew which residents were struggling. And she knew which charge nurse on the 2nd floor had been quietly covering for a colleague whose performance had been declining for 6 months. She knew all of this because it was her hospital to know. But the nurse behind that counter did not know any of that yet. In about 3 hours, she would understand everything. "Yo, I need you to stop what you are doing right now and pay attention, because this woman just got talked to, like she wandered in off the street, and nobody in that waiting room said a single word. Not one person looked up. Not one person said anything. We are just getting started, and I need you to stay with me. Let us get into it." Her name was Dr. Cecilia Ames Whitfield. She was 43 years old. She had grown up in the East Garfield Park neighborhood of Chicago, on a block where the corner store had iron bars on the windows that the owner had installed after the 3rd break-in and had never gotten around to removing even after the neighborhood changed. Because the neighborhood never really changed. Not in the ways that mattered. The elementary school 2 blocks over had a roof that leaked when it rained hard, and the administration had been requesting a repair budget for 4 years. And in the meantime, the teachers kept contractor bags in the supply closet and spread them over the equipment when a storm was coming. Cecilia had learned long division at a desk with a water stain on its surface, the shape of something almost recognizable. She had been 7 years old when she decided she was going to be a doctor. She did not tell anyone for 3 years. She filed it away in the part of herself that she kept private and worked toward it quietly. The way her mother had taught her to work toward things that other people might tell you were too far away. Her mother's name was Loretta Ames. Loretta was a compact woman who wore her hair natural before it was fashionable, and who sang in the church choir every 3rd Sunday, and who had worked the overnight shift at a commercial laundry facility for 19 years, without missing a single scheduled shift except once. When Cecilia was 10 years old, and had a fever that climbed to 104 in the middle of the night, and Loretta had called her supervisor, herself, a thing she had never done, and she had held Cecilia through the whole night in the blue chair beside the window. The laundry facility processed hospital linens. She pressed the sheets that went onto the beds of the hospital 2 miles from their house, the one they could not afford to use. She came home in the mornings smelling of steam and detergent, with her hands pink from the heat, and her back carrying the posture of someone who had been on her feet for 8 hours, and was not going to let it show, and she slept until noon, and then she sat at the kitchen table and helped Cecilia with homework. The mathematics homework, as the years went on, went further than Loretta's own education could follow. She did not pretend otherwise. She sat beside her daughter, and she read the textbook from the beginning of the relevant chapter, and she worked each problem alongside Cecilia, checking her own steps before she checked her daughter's, the same way she had been trained to check the folding on a fitted sheet. Methodically, from the corners inward, without cutting steps. She said the same thing every afternoon for 11 years. The work doesn't care who does it. If you do it right, it stays right. Cecilia's father, a man named Raymond Ames, had died of a heart attack when Cecilia was 7 years old. He had been 41. He had worked construction since he was 19, and he had a strong laugh and calloused hands, and a habit of whistling while he worked. A specific pattern of notes that Cecilia could still reproduce exactly if she tried, though she rarely tried, because it lived in a part of her that she tended carefully. He left behind a toolbox, a red metal craftsman with a broken latch he had never gotten around to fixing, which was characteristic, because Raymond Ames was the kind of man who fixed other people's things and left his own in good enough condition indefinitely. Inside the toolbox, underneath the socket wrenches, was a single index card in his handwriting. The card had been there long enough that the edges had softened. It said, "Someone in this family is going to change what the word Ames means. Make it be you." Her mother had found it when she was clearing out his tools to make room in the closet. 8 months after the funeral. She had not told Cecilia about it until Cecilia was 16 years old and had just been offered a partial scholarship to a magnet school on the north side. She pressed the index card flat on the kitchen table between them, smoothing it with both thumbs, the way you smooth a photograph that has been folded. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Then Loretta got up and put the kettle on, and they sat together with their tea and the index card between them. And that was how Cecilia understood what she was supposed to do with the next 25 years of her life. The magnet school was on the north side, and Cecilia took the bus 90 minutes each way, 5 days a week, for 2 years. The bus transferred downtown and then back out again, and on the long leg of the ride she read. She kept a notebook. She wrote down every term she did not recognize and looked each one up the same night. She wore the same 2 blazers on rotation and kept them spotless, pressing them herself on Sunday evenings with the iron that had belonged to her grandmother. She ate the free lunch and thanked the cafeteria staff by name every single time, because her mother had raised her to see the people doing necessary work. She graduated 3rd in her class at a school full of children whose parents had resources Cecilia was only beginning to learn the names of, and she had done it on bus tokens and library books, and the kind of focused ambition that does not need external validation because it generates its own fuel. She enrolled at the University of Illinois on a full academic scholarship. She finished her undergraduate degree in 3 years, taking overloaded course schedules each semester and spending her summers in research programs that paid small stipends she sent most of home. She entered the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine at 21, the youngest student in her cohort. She did her residency in internal medicine at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where her supervisor wrote in her evaluation that she possessed clinical instincts that appear to be more developed than her years of training could fully account for, which was the kind of compliment that carries inside it the surprised tone that Cecilia had learned to receive without expression. She completed a fellowship in hospital administration and medical leadership at Johns Hopkins. She published 14 peer-reviewed papers, primarily focused on emergency triage equity and the ways in which institutional processes for pain assessment produced racially disparate outcomes. The last paper in the series had been cited by the Joint Commission in updated national triage guidelines. She had received the citation notice on a Tuesday afternoon and had printed it out and mailed the printout, without comment, to her mother in East Garfield Park. Loretta had called the following Saturday and said, "I put it on the refrigerator." That was all. That was everything. For the past 3 years, Cecilia had been the chief of medicine at Hargrove Memorial Hospital. This hospital, the one with the fluorescent lobby, and the plastic chairs, and the number 47 in her hand. She was here tonight because her daughter had called her at 10:47 in the evening. Maya was 22 years old and in her 2nd year of nursing school, which was a fact that carried its own weight, its own particular generational arc. The daughter of the chief of medicine, training to be a nurse at her mother's hospital, learning from the inside the systems her mother spent her career trying to improve. Maya had been experiencing sharp abdominal pain since that afternoon. She had waited as long as she could before calling. That was how Cecilia had raised her. You wait to be sure, you assess before you escalate, you do not take up space until you are certain you need it. It was good medical training. It was also, Cecilia recognized on some level she did not examine tonight. The thing she had taught her daughter to do, in a world that required it of her specifically. Cecilia had driven 40 minutes across the city. She had arrived at the emergency department of her own hospital. She had looked at the triage desk and she had taken a number. She was not in her office clothes tonight. She had come from her mother's birthday dinner, the first time in 4 years that all 3 of Loretta's children had managed to be in the same city on the same date. And she was wearing the charcoal coat, the good one, cashmere, a gift from Maya 2 Christmases ago, over a dark dress. Her badge, the one that read Chief of Medicine in capital letters across the top, with her photograph and her name, and the Hargrove Memorial seal below it, was clipped to the inside lapel of the coat. Facing inward, she had not thought to turn it out. She had not thought she would need to. She had not thought that in the hospital she ran, whose triage protocols she had personally revised 18 months ago, specifically to reduce wait times for undertreated patient populations, her daughter would sit for 3 hours in a plastic chair, while her intake form sat in a bin stamped non-urgent by a staff code that did not belong to any clinician. She did not know that part yet. She would. The waiting room at Hargrove Memorial's emergency department held 42 chairs. 31 were occupied when Cecilia sat down. The room smelled of industrial cleaner underneath something organic and stale. The overhead television played a cable news channel, with the volume too low to hear, and the closed caption running a sentence behind the anchor's mouth. A child of about 3 was sitting across the aisle from Cecilia with a coloring book and a single red crayon, filling in a cartoon dog with determined strokes. And Cecilia watched the child for a moment and felt something in her chest do something it did not have a name for. 20 minutes passed. The board above the intake desk moved. Number 61 was called. Cecilia looked at her slip, 47. She looked at the board. 61 had arrived after her. She watched the woman holding the 61 slip stand and gather her coat and walk toward the intake doors, and she watched the doors open and close, and she sat with it for a moment before she stood. She walked to the desk. She said, "Excuse me, I believe my number was skipped. 47. My daughter is in pain and I would like to understand the prioritization system." The charge nurse's name, according to the badge, was Patricia Holden. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was typing. Then she looked up and looked at Cecilia the way some people look at a thing that has not moved when they expected it to. "Ma'am, our triage system prioritizes based on clinical acuity. If your daughter's condition was assessed as non-urgent, she waits behind urgent cases. That is how triage works." "I understand how triage works," Cecilia said. Her voice was even. "I am asking whether my daughter was properly assessed. She has not been seen by anyone since we arrived." She filled out the intake form. Patricia Holden pointed at the clipboard return bin beside the desk. "Intake forms are reviewed in order. When a clinician is available, she will be called. She has been in pain for 5 hours." The woman did not respond to this directly. Instead, she said, in the tone of someone concluding a conversation that they consider finished, "Ma'am, I have over 20 patients in this department right now. Abdominal discomfort in a young woman with no documented history is not an urgent presentation. If her condition worsens materially, you come back to this desk. Otherwise, I need you to return to your seat." There was a man sitting in the 3rd row near the window. He was white and appeared to be in his late 60s and was wearing a fleece vest over a collared shirt, and he had arrived at the department 20. 3 minutes after Cecilia and Maya had sat down, Cecilia had watched him approach the desk. She had watched the interaction. It had lasted less than 45 seconds, nothing like the one she had just experienced. His voice had been pleasant, and the nurse's responding voice had been pleasant back, and a second intake form had been produced from below the counter. A different form, shorter. Cecilia had noted this, and he had been directed to a chair near the front. She had watched this, and she had set it somewhere inside herself, and she had said nothing. He had been taken back behind the intake doors 11 minutes ago. She returned to her seat. She sat beside Maya, who had her knees drawn up and her arms folded across her abdomen, and she placed one hand gently on Maya's back. The muscles were taut under the fabric of her shirt. Maya did not look up. She was the kind of young woman who had been raised inside the healthcare system, who understood its rhythms and its pressures, and who did not want to be a burden inside it, even when she was the one who needed it to work. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she was pressing both of those things into service right now, sitting still and breathing carefully and not asking for anything. Cecilia kept her hand moving in slow circles on her daughter's back, the same motion she had used when Maya was small, and running a fever, the kind of muscle memory that lives below language and does not require permission to deploy. An hour passed, the board moved. Numbers were called. 47 was not among them. 3 more people arrived at the desk and were processed and directed to chairs. 2 more were taken back through the intake doors. Neither of them was Maya. Cecilia tracked all of it with the part of her mind that was always tracking, the clinical part that had been trained across decades to observe and assess. And she kept her hand on her daughter's back and she sat. At the 90-minute mark, she returned to the desk. A second staff member was present now, a man in administrative scrubs reviewing something on a tablet. She addressed him directly because addressing Patricia Holden a second time had already produced nothing actionable. She explained the situation with precision, using the specific clinical vocabulary that she had spent years developing. Acute onset, duration of symptoms, progression pattern, differential possibilities given age and presentation. She used the language correctly, in the way it is used by people who use it every day, and she watched the man's face for the flicker of recognition that sometimes comes when a person in a medical context hears another person speaking, like they know what they are talking about. The man looked at the charge nurse. The charge nurse looked at the man. Something passed between them that did not require words and did not include Cecilia. Then the man said, not unkindly but not with any particular care either, "Ma'am, I understand your concern. Let me flag it for the attending." He made a note on the tablet. He set the tablet face down on the desk. He returned to the call on his phone. The tablet stayed face down. She went back and sat down. At the 2-hour mark, Maya said quietly, "Mom, it's getting worse." Her voice had the flat quality of someone who has been managing pain for long enough that the management itself has become exhausting. Cecilia looked at her daughter's face. There was a faint gray quality at her temples and around her mouth, at the corners of her eyes, that Cecilia recognized. Not panic, not drama. Clinical gray, the color the face goes when the body is putting a significant amount of its resources towards something internal and is drawing down on what it has available for the surface. She had seen that color many times in her career. She knew what it meant. She went back to the desk. "My daughter has been waiting 2 hours and her symptoms have materially worsened," she said. "I need her seen by a clinician right now." Patricia Holden did not look up from her screen. "Ma'am, I have already explained the protocol. Raising your voice is not going to change our process." Cecilia had not raised her voice. She was acutely aware of this, aware of exactly what her voice was doing, had been aware of it for 2 hours. She was aware that the sentence had manufactured a raised voice in order to preemptively categorize whatever she said next. She knew this maneuver from the literature. She had read it described for first-person accounts by patients and family members in the qualitative data, sections of the papers she had cited in her own work. She was standing inside a case study she had written. "I have not raised my voice," she said. "I am communicating that my daughter is deteriorating. I would like to speak with the attending physician directly. The attending is with a patient. I am willing to wait outside that patient's room for the attending to become available. You are not permitted in the clinical area without authorization. Then please authorize me. That is not something I can do from this desk." Cecilia looked at her. "I need your name." The charge nurse's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. The small recalibration that happens when someone has decided that the person in front of them has become a category of problem rather than a person requiring assistance. "My name is on my badge," she said, "and if you continue to approach this desk in an escalating manner, I am going to need to call security." Cecilia looked at the badge. She read the name. She said Patricia Holden's full name once, quietly. In the internal place where she stored things, she needed to be certain she remembered, and she returned to her seat. 12 minutes later, a security guard appeared at her elbow. He was a young man, large and quiet and clearly uncomfortable with the specific task he had been given. And he said, with more courtesy than the situation required, "Ma'am, we have a report of a disturbance at the intake desk. I'm going to need to ask you to either remain seated or step outside." Cecilia looked at him carefully. He was young, early 20s, and there was nothing unkind in his face, only the expression of someone who was doing what he had been directed to do by someone whose job it was to direct him. She looked at her daughter, who had her head resting against the wall behind her chair and her eyes closed and one hand pressed flat against her side. She looked at the clock above the intake desk. 2 hours and 41 minutes. "I am going to step outside to make a phone call," she said. "My daughter is to remain where she is." She walked through the automatic doors. The November air was sharp and cold, and it hit her face and she let it. She stood under the hospital's entrance canopy, beneath the Hargrove Memorial crest, her hospital's crest, the one she had signed paperwork under for 3 years, and she took out her phone. She did not call the police. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call the patient advocate office, which was closed at this hour. She called Dr. James Okafor, who was her deputy chief of staff and her second in command, and who had been in this job for 14 months because she had hired him, specifically because he was the kind of person you called at 1 in the morning when something needed to be corrected immediately and correctly. He picked up on the third ring, and she could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who had been deeply asleep 60 seconds earlier and was now fully present, which was one of the things she valued about him. She told him where she was. She told him what had happened, in the order that it had happened, without editorializing, with timestamps, because she had been keeping track. She told him what she needed. She spoke for 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Then she went back inside and sat beside her daughter, and put her hand on her daughter's back, and she waited. 11 minutes later, the emergency department doors opened and did not stop. Now hold on. 11 minutes. That is all it took for James Okafor to get dressed, get in his car, and call everyone who needed to be called on the way. 11 minutes. Let us watch this. Dr. James Okafor entered the emergency department at 2 minutes past 1 in the morning, wearing a coat over a collared shirt, and behind him came Dr. Renata Solis, the department head of emergency medicine, who had driven from home and was still in street clothes, and whose face had the controlled expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific confirmation to arrive. Behind Renata came Howard, the night security supervisor, a man who had worked at Hargrove Memorial for 16 years, and who knew every face in this building, including the one currently sitting in plastic. Chair 14. Howard was carrying a laptop. James walked directly to the intake desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said, "Patricia Holden." And his voice in that lobby was the kind of quiet that is louder than noise. The kind that makes the room understand that the person using it does not need volume, because what they are saying has its own weight. Patricia Holden looked up from her screen. She looked at James. She looked at Renata Solis standing behind him. She looked at Howard with the laptop. She looked, because you cannot not look, at the woman in the charcoal coat sitting in plastic chair 14 in the middle of the waiting room, completely still watching. "I'm Patricia Holden," she said. "Dr. James Okafor, Deputy Chief of Staff." He did not extend his hand. "I need you to explain, in the next 60 seconds, why the patient in seat 14 has been waiting 2 hours and 48 minutes with a progressively worsening abdominal presentation, and why, when her family member made 3 documented requests for clinical escalation, those requests were logged in the intake system as a patient-family disturbance." Every person in that waiting room had stopped, all 31 of them. The television above the desk was still playing with the caption running a sentence behind. Nobody was watching it. Patricia Holden said, the patient was assessed as non-urgent on initial intake. She was not assessed, Renata Solis said, and her voice was precise in the way that certain instruments are precise, not sharp but exact. "I pulled the intake file from my phone on the way in from the parking structure. There is no clinical notation on this file. There is a non-acute checkbox that is not initialed by a clinician. It carries the desk staff code, not a nursing assessment code, which means this patient was priority categorized without a clinical evaluation, which is a violation of the revised intake protocol that has been in place for 18 months. She paused. "Your initials are on the form, Miss Holden. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system. Patricia Holden's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She looked at the form on her screen. She looked at Renata. She looked at James. She looked at Howard, who was opening the laptop. James turned, partially, toward the waiting room, and he said, clearly enough that the room heard it, every person, every face. The child with the red crayon. Dr. Ames Whitfield, I am deeply sorry for the delay, doctor. Solis is going to take Maya back to an examination room right now. The room heard that, the title, the name, Dr. Ames Whitfield. The administrative staff member who had set his tablet face down, looked at his tablet, and looked at the woman in the coat, and looked at his tablet. Again. The young security guard who had come to Cecilia's elbow looked at Patricia Holden, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. And not entirely succeeding, Cecilia stood. She picked up the overnight bag. She walked 3 steps toward the intake desk, and then she stopped and she reached inside the front of her charcoal coat, and she found the badge that was clipped to the inside lapel, facing inward, the way it had been all evening, and she unclipped it and clipped it to the outside, facing forward, so that the photograph and the name and the title and the seal were all visible to anyone who cared to look. Chief of Medicine. Her photograph, 3 years old, taken in her office on the morning she officially accepted the role, her name, the Hargrove Memorial crest in the corner. She had not planned this. She did it the way you do the things that your body has already decided before your mind has finished the sentence. She stood there for a moment with the badge on the outside of her coat, and she looked at Patricia Holden, not with anger. The anger was in her. She knew exactly where it was. She had been carrying it for 2 hours and 48 minutes, and she knew its precise weight. But she did not put it in her face. What was in her face was something quieter than that, and older, and more permanent. Let us go take care of my daughter, she said. Oh, she turned the badge out. She did not have to say another word, not one extra word. Let us keep going, doctor. Solis took Maya back in 4 minutes. The evaluation that followed was efficient and thorough, and conducted with the kind of focused attention that reframes everything preceding it. The imaging confirmed what Cecilia's clinical instincts had been tracking for the past 90 minutes. An ovarian cyst, significant, that had been enlarging for several hours, and required immediate monitoring and a likelihood of intervention. It had not yet ruptured. The attending, a third-year resident who had been briefed by Renata on the way to the room and who moved through the examination with the particular focused courtesy of someone who understands the full weight of the situation he is operating in, said at once, quietly and directly, another hour without assessment would have produced a surgical emergency. The chances of a rupture in that window were, in his clinical judgment, high. He did not repeat it, he documented it. Cecilia sat in the chair beside Maya's bed. She held her daughter's hand in both of hers. Maya was on a drip and had her eyes closed, and the gray at her temples and around her mouth was already lightening, the color coming back in the slow way that happens when a body that has been holding something difficult is finally allowed to put it down. Cecilia held the hand carefully, with the specific care of a person who has been running on adrenaline and discipline for nearly 3 hours, and has just been given permission to stop, and she did not move for a while. She just held on. In the hallway outside room 9, things were moving. Howard had pulled the full lobby surveillance footage from the past 3 hours onto the department laptop. The intake desk had a fixed overhead camera, installed as part of a security upgrades Cecilia had approved 14 months ago, and it captured the counter and the immediate area around it with clear resolution and time-stamped audio. It showed Cecilia's first approach to the desk and Patricia Holden's response. It showed the second approach and the administrative staff member's note on the tablet and the tablet going face down. It showed the third approach and the words that were exchanged. It showed the security guard arriving at Cecilia's elbow and the direction he had been given to go there. It showed Patricia Holden's notation on the intake form. It showed all of it, in sequence without ambiguity. James was on the phone with the hospital's legal affairs director. Renata had sat down in the nursing station across from room 9 and was writing, in a manner that suggested she had been waiting for this particular writing for some time. She had been filing reports about triage disparity in this department for 14 months. Detailed, clinical, specific reports with dates and case numbers and outcome differentials. And those reports had been received by the administrator who had held the chief of medicine role before Cecilia, and had been logged and not acted upon. She had continued filing them after Cecilia took the role because Cecilia had asked her to, had said in their first meeting together that she wanted the documentation to be complete and current and continuous. Renata had kept filing. Tonight she was writing the most recent entry. At 8 in the morning, after Maya had been transferred to an observation room on the second floor, and was sleeping with the specific deep quality of someone whose body has finally been listened to, Patricia Holden was called to a meeting. The room held Dr. Okafor, the Human Resources Director, the Legal Affairs Representative, and a union representative that Patricia had the right to request and had requested. The meeting lasted 51 minutes. At its conclusion, Patricia Holden was placed on his immediate administrative suspension, pending a formal review and investigation. The grounds included the triage protocol violation, the fabricated escalation log, and preliminary review of the surveillance footage. She was escorted from the building by Howard. At 8:47 in the morning, the badge exchange at the front was observed by 4 staff members on the morning shift, none of whom said anything, all of whom told the story to someone before noon. The administrative staff member who had set the tablet face down received a formal written reprimand the same morning and was reassigned to a non-patient contact administrative role, pending the full investigation. He did not contest the reassignment. He signed the paperwork without asking any questions, which suggested he had spent the hours since 1 in the morning already understanding what was coming. The young security guard was interviewed separately. The footage made clear what had happened. He had received a direction from a charge nurse and had followed it without sufficient grounds to do otherwise. He had not acted with malicious intent towards Cecilia. He had been put in a position by someone above him in the immediate chain, and he had done what he was directed to do. Cecilia, when asked in the review whether she believed he bore individual culpability, said no. His record was not affected. He came to her office 2 weeks later and knocked on the open door and said he was sorry, quietly and without rehearsal, and she told him she accepted it and meant it, and she told him she hoped he remembered the night, not as a thing he had done wrong, but as a thing he now knew how to recognize. The formal review took 6 weeks. Cecilia wrote it herself, with Renata Solis's input on the clinical data and the legal department's input on the documentation standards. It was 112 pages. Its title was Racial and Socioeconomic Disparities in Emergency Triage Prioritization at Hargrove Memorial, a Systemic Review and Policy Revision Framework. It opened with an executive summary that used clear language and did not soften its conclusions. It drew on 14 months of intake data. It cited Renata's accumulated reports. It identified 11 specific protocol failures, 4 training gaps, 2 documentation practices that structurally disadvantaged undertreated patient populations, and 1 intake assessment form that had last been updated in 2016. The same year Cecilia had been publishing research on exactly this kind of form. The surveillance footage from the night of November 14th was included as a case study appendix, anonymized per legal guidance. Anyone familiar with the event knew what they were reading. She presented it to the full board on a Tuesday morning in January. The boardroom at Hargrove Memorial had 14 chairs and a projector and windows that faced the city, and Cecilia stood at the front, and she spoke clearly for 41 minutes without notes. When she finished, the board chair, a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had spent 12 of the past 36 months questioning whether Cecilia was right for the role, sat at the head of the table with his hands flat in front of him, and he said, "What do you need?" Those words, not a question inflected as a question, a statement shaped like one, she told him. The board approved every recommendation, unanimously, without the debate she had prepared herself for. The approval covered a mandatory emergency triage equity training program for all patient-facing staff to be conducted twice yearly with outcome tracking, a revised intake assessment form co-authored by Cecilia and Renata that required an initialed clinical notation before any priority category could be assigned, an anonymous patient and family reporting pathway for potential triage bias, reviewed monthly by a committee that included community representatives, and the establishment of the Hargrove Memorial Health Equity Fund, a $500,000 endowment administered in partnership with 3 historically Black community health organizations on the south and west sides of Chicago, providing subsidized urgent care access to populations that had historically avoided emergency departments due to documented negative experiences with institutional treatment. The fund's inaugural director was a woman named Dr. Alicia Brennan. She was 31 years old. She had grown up 6 blocks from Cecilia in East Garfield Park, had gone to the same elementary school with the leaking roof and the contractor bags, in the supply closet, had worked night shifts as a certified nursing assistant for 4 years to cover her tuition at Rush University while completing her medical degree. She had applied in response to a job posting that Cecilia had written the language for herself, late on a Sunday night, thinking about all the specific things the person in that role was going to need to be. Alicia Brennan had been exactly those things. Patricia Holden did not return to Hargrove Memorial. The formal investigation, concluded 3 months after the November incident, found a pattern of conduct that extended well beyond a single night. 17 months of nursing staff complaint records that had been filed through the internal system and not escalated. A prior formal complaint from a patient family that had been resolved without investigation under the notation, "No further action required," by the department administrator, who had since been reassigned in an unrelated restructuring. The investigation's findings were reported to the State Nursing Regulatory Board for review. The board conducted its own proceedings over 5 months. These proceedings were public record. At the conclusion of the regulatory proceeding, Patricia Holden was required to appear before the board and read a formal acknowledgement of the conduct findings into the public record. Her attorney had submitted proposed language. The board rejected 3 drafts before approving a final version. The language that Patricia Holden read aloud, in a room with 17 people, and a recording that would be filed in the Public Regulatory Archive, described Cecilia as, among other things, a physician of substantial professional standing whose presentation at the triage desk on the night in question was managed in a manner inconsistent with appropriate patient care standards. The attorneys had debated the word distinguished for 15 minutes before settling on substantial. The woman who had told Cecilia she belonged in a waiting room down the hall now stood at a podium and called her substantially professionally standing, and the smallness of that language, its reluctance, its verbal minimum wage, was audible to every person in that room. The recording was not published. The findings were. They appeared in the State Regulatory Board's quarterly report, which was publicly accessible to anyone who went looking for it. A healthcare journalist who covered hospital policy and institutional equity for a national publication went looking 3 weeks after the findings were posted. Because a source had sent her a note, she filed 2 requests for comment and received one. She wrote a 4,000-word piece that did not dramatize and did not sensationalize and instead named the structures, named the policy gaps, named the 17 months of unescalated complaints, named the fund and what it was built to do. She interviewed Cecilia twice, with the hospital communications officer present, and Cecilia spoke with the care of someone who has been building a case for a long time and understands what it means to put words on record. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Sunday it had been read over 900,000 times. The comments section was long. Loretta Ames turned 68 years old in November, 1 year after the night, with the waiting room, and the number 47. Her daughter drove her to the hospital on a cold morning in late October, 2 weeks before the birthday, when the light was the thin pale gold of the end of autumn. They parked in the visitor lot, and they walked together to the emergency department. Entrance. Beside the automatic doors, mounted to the exterior wall at eye height, there was a panel of brushed steel, not large, installed 3 months earlier. It read, "The Hargrove Memorial Tridge Equity Initiative, established in recognition of every patient who waited too long." Below that, in recognition of Dr. Cecilia Ames Whitfield, Chief of Medicine. And below that, in smaller text in italics, "The work doesn't care who does it. If you do it right, it stays right." The quote was attributed. It had a name, Loretta Ames. Loretta stood in front of it and she looked at her name on the wall. She reached out and touched the letters with 2 fingers, the same way she had touched the index card at the kitchen table all those years ago, smoothing something flat that was already flat. She pulled her hand back. She looked at her daughter beside her. She pressed both hands over her chest, the same gesture she always made when something entered her that she did not have language for. The tears ran silently down her face, not in a way that asked for attention, just in the way that happens when a body finally releases something it has held for a long time. The automatic doors opened and closed in the cold air. The city moved around them. The morning was bright and cold and full of the kind of light that does not apologize for arriving. Cecilia put her arm around her mother, and they stood there together in front of the wall for as long as they needed to. Nobody asked them to move. Nobody looked at them wrong. Nobody calculated anything about them from across a desk. Maya graduated from nursing school the following May. She gave the student commencement address. She talked about triage, about the clinical and the human meaning of the word, about what it means to assess someone fully before you decide what they need, to see all of them. Not the surface approximation, the category, the assumption, but the actual person with the actual history and the actual pain. She talked about sitting in a waiting room one November evening as a patient, and what she had observed from a plastic chair, and what she had decided to carry forward into every room she would ever stand in as a nurse. She did not name anyone. She did not need to. She received her nursing pin that afternoon. Her mother put it on her. Cecilia's hands were steady. Maya's eyes were not entirely. She laughed at herself for it softly, the way you laugh at the part of yourself that refuses to be professional about the things that actually matter. Cecilia laughed too, briefly, and then neither of them laughed because they were standing inside something that did not require any additional language. The pin on the white coat. The distance between the iron bars on the corner store window and this moment. Not as long as some people thought. Not as short as others pretended. Loretta sat in the third row of the auditorium with her good coat on, and her hands in her lap and her late husband's index card in her purse, folded once. She watched her granddaughter receive a pin, and she watched her daughter's hands put it in place, and she pressed both palms against her chest, and she did not make a sound. The work stays right. She had said that every day for 11 years at a kitchen table, and it had stayed right. It was right here in front of her, in a white coat, on a May afternoon, in a city that had not always made it easy to stay. Okay, I need a moment. Because this story, the badge on the inside of the coat, the index card in the toolbox, the number 47, Loretta's words on a wall outside the door, this one required something. Now this story is fictional. We built it, we wrote it, we shaped it from research and love. And the knowledge stories like this one are true in the ways that matter. Even when the specific names are not, but the experience at the center of it, being unseen in a space you have every right to occupy, being made to prove yourself before being treated like a human being, watching someone else be served first while you hold a number that should have been called, that is not fictional. That has happened today. It happened yesterday. It will happen next week in a waiting room, somewhere in this country. To someone who should not have to be a chief of medicine to receive appropriate care. So here is what I need you to do right now. In the comments below, I want you to tell me, have you ever been in a room where you had to work twice as hard just to be heard? Have you ever been made to wait while someone else was seen first? Have you ever watched a system decide before it looked at you fully what category to put you in? Drop it below. Tell your story. Because the comment section on these videos is where the real ones get told, and those stories matter. If this one moved you, if it said something you needed today, hit the like button right now and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the work stays right when it is done right. Subscribe if you are new here. We come every week, we go deep, we do not cut corners, and we tell the stories that deserve to be told the way they deserve to be told. We will see you in the next one.